Hey guys, tonight we begin with a role no one volunteered for. Being a child in the Middle Ages, and I know that doesn't sound like a job, but trust me, it came with more responsibilities, danger, and unpaid overtime than you'd believe. In a world where being a rat catcher was considered normal, and plague survival was a full-time lifestyle, just making it to your 5th birthday. Because medieval childhood wasn't about wooden toys and singing by the fire. It was more like wake up, carry buckets, dodge, dysentery, and don't cry or someone might think you're lazy. There were no bedtime stories, just real-time lessons in disease, famine, and the occasional arranged marriage. And if you're picturing peasant kids as the only ones struggling, spoiler, noble kids weren't much better. Just more silk, stricter rules, and fancier punishments. So, before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if this kind of grim, weird, slightly depressing history helps you wind down. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where this little medieval misery tour is reaching. Now dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and settle in. Because tonight we're going back to a time when being born was dangerous, but being a kid, that was worse. From the moment you could walk, you were expected to work. Not help, not contribute, work, as in daily, physical, exhausting, repetitive, and entirely non-optional. If you were lucky, your first task was feeding chickens or watching the fire. If not, you were hauling buckets of water twice your weight or hearing livestock that didn't care you were 3 feet tall. There was no age of play. Childhood wasn't a protected phase of life. It was a holding pattern between birth and usefulness. And if you couldn't prove your usefulness quickly, well then you were just another mouth to feed in a world that rarely had enough bread for the people already working. No toys, no breaks, no expectations beyond survival. Your days were full of chores, not just to learn responsibility, but to keep your family alive. Firewood didn't gather itself. Meals didn't cook on their own. Animals didn't wait patiently to be tended. You weren't learning life skills, you were life support. And it wasn't like there was a gentle transition either. There was no first steps, first chores chart, stuck to a wooden wall with a cute little star system. One day, someone older simply handed you a broom or a basket or a blunt knife and said, "Go." That was it. You were in the workforce now, by age. 5 or 6, most peasant children could milk animals, haul water, sweep ashes, and babysit their younger siblings. Not because it was adorable, but because if they didn't, something didn't get done. And if something didn't get done, people suffered. You weren't helping, you were necessary. And for noble children, the ones living in big stone homes with tapestries and trained tutors, their version of play wasn't exactly recess either. By the time a noble child could stand properly, they were already being trained to stand correctly. Posture, tone of voice, etiquette. Every move was a preparation for adulthood. Boys practiced sword forms with wooden weapons, not for fun, but because they were expected to be soldiers before their voices changed. Girls practiced bowing, sitting, smiling, and managing households they wouldn't own until marriage contracts were signed, usually without their consent. Even games, if you could call them that, were rehearsals for roles, war games, courtly dramas, mock feasts. If you laughed too, loudly or fell out of character, you got scolded or worse, punished. Joy wasn't encouraged, discipline was. Back in the villages, things weren't much softer. You didn't get weekends, you didn't get holidays unless it was a church feast day, and even then, you were probably cleaning up after it. The work was constant, seasonal, endless. Spring planting, summer tending, autumn harvesting, winter not dying. There were no lazy Sundays, just days where the frost made the water too hard to carry. So you started later and worked faster. And while modern childhood has all kinds of protective language around it, emotional needs, safe environments, developmental stages, none of that applied here. If you cried, you were told to stop being weak. If you hesitated, you were scolded for being slow. If you got sick, that was unfortunate, but not uncommon. Life moved on. The family needed hands, not feelings. And if you're thinking, okay, sure, but what about the really little kids? Didn't babies get doted on at least? Sort of. For the first few months of life, infants were watched over mostly because infant mortality was so high. Everyone lived in fear of losing them, but affection was restrained. Many families avoided even naming their children until they were older. Sometimes not until the child passed age 5. Why? Because they were too afraid to get attached to someone who might not survive the winter. There were exceptions, of course. Stories of kind parents, sweet la'abis, mothers who rocked their babies to sleep despite the aching in their backs. But those stories are rare because survival stories were the default. Kindness was a bonus, not a baseline. And when you were tired, truly deeply exhausted after a day of sunburns, blisters, bruises, and boredom, you didn't collapse into a soft bed with stuffed animals and a lullaby soundtrack. You crawled into straw, real straw, itchy, dusty, possibly bug-infested straw. You wrapped yourself in a coarse wool blanket, hoped rats didn't bite your toes, and tried to sleep while your parents whispered about debts, droughts, or the neighbor's sudden fever. There was no bedtime story, just silence and aching limbs. And no matter how young you were, no one ever said, "You've done enough." Because enough didn't exist. Not in a world where every day was a fight against hunger, cold, illness, and taxes. So yeah, maybe you imagine medieval kids running barefoot through meadows laughing under the sun. And maybe, just maybe, that happened once in a while. But most of the time they were working. They were exhausted and they were still expected to do more tomorrow. If you're picturing little medieval kids with backpacks heading off to school in the morning, stop. That didn't happen. Because unless you were the child of a noble, a monk, or incredibly lucky, school simply wasn't part of your reality. In fact, for most kids in the Middle Ages, the only thing you were expected to study was whatever your parents did. And you didn't need books for that. Just eyes, hands, and the ability to keep up without complaining. Reading optional, writing unheard of, tuition free because no one was teaching you anything in a classroom. Instead, your education came in the form of repetition. You learned by watching, by copying, by doing, over and over and over. If your father was a blacksmith, congratulations, you'd be hammering metal before your arms were strong enough to lift the tools. If your mother spun wool, you'd be twisting fibers until your fingers ached. And no one asked if you were interested. Interest didn't matter. Curiosity was a luxury. You were being trained to survive. And survival didn't come with electives. There were no future career paths. Your path was chosen the moment you were born. Your name, your trade, your fate, all inherited. In peasant families, boys learned from fathers, girls from mothers. Farming, baking, tanning leather, weaving baskets, brewing beer. If your parents did it, you would too. There were no certifications, no exams, just the expectation that you'd eventually become a carbon copy of whoever raised you. Not because they lacked imagination, but because deviation was dangerous. Trying something new meant risk, and risk that was for people who could afford to fail. For most children, school wasn't missed. It simply wasn't imagined. The closest thing you got to formal learning was being yelled at when you did something wrong. And lessons were rarely gentle. Mistakes weren't teachable moments. They were just reasons to get hit with a wooden spoon. Or worse, you didn't get encouraging lectures. You got silence, side-eye, or swift correction. Why didn't anyone teach me this? Because you were supposed to just know, like magic or muscle memory. Now, if you were born into a noble or merchant family, things might look a little different. You might have a private tutor, not a cheerful, patient educator, but a stern man in robes who taught you Latin and reminded you constantly that your family paid too much for you to be this slow. For noble boys, education focused on law, religion, politics, things that helped maintain power. Girls, their education involved embroidery, dancing, and learning how to politely keep quiet in public. Not exactly empowering, but hey, at least it came with parchment. If your family had ties to the church, maybe you got sent to a monastery school. That meant prayers at dawn, chanting, scripture copying, and hours of silence broken only by your own confusion. It wasn't Hogwarts, it was repetition and obedience. And again, only a tiny privileged few got that chance. For everyone else, the idea of school was about as distant as the moon. And books don't even start. Most homes didn't have a single one, not even for decoration. Books were handwritten, chained to shelves, and cost more than your entire yearly income. So when people say education is power, they're right. And in medieval times, that power was hoarded. Literacy was like gold. The church guarded it, nobles rationed it, and peasants, they were expected to live and die without ever needing it. But still, children learned, just not what we'd call academic knowledge. They learned how to spot a sick animal by its walk, how to tell the weather from the wind, how to balance a basket on your back without tipping, how to avoid the Lord's tax collector, how to lie convincingly when asked about missing eggs. Street smart? Yes. Book smart? Not a chance. So no, there wasn't a school bell, but there was a rooster, and when it crowed, you got up not to learn about the world, but to help keep it moving. And you did that every day, without complaint, without rest, without recess. Because if you didn't, someone else, someone bigger, would remind you why you should have. If you think getting sick today is annoying, try catching a cold in the 1300s. No clinics, no Tylenol, no pediatrician calling you champ. Just a leaky roof, a drafty room, and someone waving burning herbs near your face while whispering prayers in Latin. Because in the Middle Ages, getting sick wasn't an inconvenience. It was a threat. And if you were a child, that threat was constant and terrifying. You see, back then, nobody really knew what germs were. There were no microscopes, no soap commercials, no scientific consensus. Illness was explained using 4 mysterious fluids called humors, or blamed on bad air, angry gods, or your neighbor's evil thoughts. And unfortunately, none of those explanations came with cures that worked. A child with a fever wasn't seen as a mild concern. A fever was a warning, a shadow, a countdown. Because once your body started acting up, sweating too much, coughing too hard, or going quiet and pale, the adults around you didn't say, "It'll pass." They said, "Start praying." Common colds weren't so common when your house had no insulation, no clean water, and no real heat. You caught chills easily, and you didn't stay home from school because, remember, there was no school. You just kept working, shivering, coughing, until someone noticed you'd stopped moving. And that was just the beginning. Water sources were often polluted. You drank from wells shared with animals. Waste disposal, a polite term for just throw it somewhere and hope the rain takes it. Hygiene was minimal, not because people didn't care, but because they didn't understand what caused disease in the first place. Bathing was rare, toothbrushes were non-existent, and soap expensive. Children shared beds, spoons, food, and of course germs. So when one child got sick, others followed fast, and even simple illnesses turned serious. A sore throat could become scarlet fever. A stomach ache could mean dysentery. A mild cut on your foot could rot your leg. Antibiotics hadn't been invented. Bandages were usually just dirty rags. Doctors, if you could even find one, offered treatments like bleeding, leeches, and balancing the humors, which often meant making the patient sicker. And guess who usually didn't even get to see the doctor? Children, especially poor children. They were low on the priority list. If help came, it came late, if at all. So, most of the time, families just waited. You wrapped the child in wool, gave them herbs, whispered prayers, and hoped. That was the treatment plan. Step 1, wait. Step 2, pray. Step 3, bury. Because death was familiar. Too familiar. Some historians estimate that in certain places up to half of all children died before the age of 5. Half. Not from dramatic things, not dragons or curses, but from things modern kids don't even miss school over. Diarrhea, ear infections, teething fevers, or untreated infections from a splinter. And the worst part, it was so common that people adjusted emotionally. Parents loved their children, yes, but they often didn't get too attached too early. Some waited months, even years, before giving their child a proper name. Because why name something you might lose before spring? It sounds cold, but it was survival. And when epidemics came, as they often did, they didn't care about age. Plague, pox, measles, influenza, they swept through entire villages, leaving behind silence. There were no vaccines, no contact tracing, no hospitals with plastic wristbands and cartoons on the ceiling. Just panic, then grief. Imagine being 6 years old and watching your siblings fade out one by one. Imagine being a mother holding your feverish baby and knowing that there was nothing you could do except wait for the crying to stop. That was the medical system. Even among the nobility, where people had more food, better shelter, and access to doctors, children still died young because no one was safe from bad air, bad luck, and bacteria that no one knew existed. Gold didn't make you immune. It just gave you nicer linens to be buried in, and there was no such thing as mental health. Counseling after loss. No understanding of trauma. A child survived smallpox and lost 3 siblings in a year. They were expected to keep working, to smile at feasts, to be grateful. You didn't get time to grieve. You got chores. So when we talk about how tough medieval childhood was, this is what we mean. It wasn't just the labor, it wasn't just the poverty, it was the constant quiet presence of death. Hovering, waiting, occasionally knocking. Childhood wasn't a promise, it was a gamble. And for most. Medieval kids, if you're listening to this right now, chances are you've already outlived most medieval children. That's not an exaggeration. That's just statistics. Because in the Middle Ages, surviving childhood was a miracle, not an expectation. And making it to age 5. That was the medieval version of graduating college with honors. You beat the odds. You won the game that most never finished. Let's look at the numbers. In some regions of medieval Europe, 30 to 50% of children died before their 5th birthday. Not from a war or famine, though those certainly didn't help, but from everyday things. Fevers, infections, malnutrition, falling into a fire pit, drinking bad water, being left in a field too long, or simply not waking up. The line between alive and gone was razor thin, and no one ever felt truly safe. A baby might be born healthy, squirming, loud, and still be gone by morning. A toddler might chase a chicken across the yard and vanish the next week from a stomach bug. Even strong children, the sturdy ones, could be taken by a bad winter or a weak harvest. And when one child got sick, it rarely stayed with one. Families lived close, huddled together in cramped cottages with smoke-stained ceilings and dirt floors. When disease came in, it came for everyone, and it didn't care how young you were. The result? Parents, especially mothers, developed a quiet form of guarded love. They cared, they held, they sang. But many didn't name their children right away. Some waited weeks. Others waited years because naming something made it real, and losing something real hurt more. It was safer emotionally to hope quietly than to celebrate too soon. Even the language reflected this fragility. In some records, babies were referred to as little ones who may not stay. Death wasn't a surprise. It was part of the rhythm. And when children did survive, people didn't throw parties. They gave thanks cautiously because the journey was far from over. Illness didn't stop at age 5. Neither did hunger or accidents or plague or war. You made it through the hardest part, yes, but the next part still brutal. What made this worse was the lack of control. Parents did what they could, wrapped their children in wool, fed them broth, prayed, sang lullabies, but deep down they knew it wasn't enough. Medicine, as we know it today, didn't exist. The best healers were often midwives or herbalists with limited tools, no training, and a lot of hope. And when things went wrong, families were left not just with grief, but with guilt. Did I forget a blessing? Did I anger a saint? Should I have burned more sage? Should I have prayed harder? Imagine carrying that weight. And this didn't just affect peasants. Noble families buried children too. In fact, they sometimes recorded births not in joy, but in fear, bracing for bad news. Royal tombs across Europe are filled with names history never remembered. Tiny coffins, carved angels, the silence of potential never reached. So, if you ever feel like you haven't accomplished much by age 20, remember in the Middle Ages, you'd already be considered a survivor. You'd be congratulated for still breathing, still walking, still being here. And that's something people often forget when they romanticize the past. The castles, the costumes, the candlelight, none of that mattered if you didn't make it past infancy. Childhood wasn't whimsical. It was a test, and most didn't pass. There are no songs about them, no statues, no records, just soft footprints in the earth. And maybe, just maybe, a mother who remembered the sound of their laugh and whispered it once before sleep. So yes, being a child. In the Middle Ages meant working hard. It meant no school, no toys, no safety. But before any of that, it meant surviving. And that in itself was a full-time job. So far, we've mostly talked about peasant children. And fair enough, they had it rough. But what about noble kids? The ones born in castles wrapped in velvet, surrounded by tutors and candlelight. Well, they didn't have it easy either. They just suffered differently. You see, being born into nobility didn't buy you a childhood. It bought you expectations. From the moment a noble child took their first breath, they weren't just someone's son or daughter. They were a political asset, a potential alliance, a walking family reputation. And that meant everything they did, from how they sat to how they spoke to how they smiled, was watched, judged, and trained into submission. For boys, childhood ended early, very early. By the age of 7, noble boys were often sent away, not for school, but to serve as pages in another noble household. Not a vacation, not a summer camp. More like a 7-year-long internship with armor polishing and speech training. You learned manners, swordplay, horse care, religion, Latin, archery, and how to bow just the right amount. Not too low, that's desperate. Not too high, that's rude. Every day was correction. Every mistake was a lesson, and not always a gentle one. And if you were clumsy or slow or too soft-spoken, someone reminded you that weakness was dangerous because someday you'd be a knight, a commander, a landholder. There was no room for softness, no room for fear. Now, noble girls, their path was different, but no less restrictive. From birth, girls were trained for marriage, not love, not partnership, marriage. And marriage meant being quiet, beautiful, obedient, and useful in that order. By age 5 or 6, noble girls were learning embroidery, music, religious recitation, and how to walk without making noise. You think walking quietly is easy? Try doing it in heavy skirts while balancing a book on your head. If you spilled ink on your gown or tripped. In front of a guest or laughed too loudly, someone took note. You were being watched always. And the reason for all this training to prepare you to be given away. Most noble girls were betrothed by age 12, married by 14, mothers by 16. Not because they were ready, but because that's what the family needed. Because again, you weren't a person. You were a contract, a connection, a doughy in motion. And don't assume that noble kids got privacy either. They didn't have bedrooms full of books and soft lighting. Most shared. Quarters with attendants, nurses, tutors, and sometimes siblings. Your emotions weren't private. Your outbursts weren't forgiven. You were expected to behave with poise, even when your teeth hurt, your dress itched, or your favorite dog died last night, and no one cared. And if you stepped out of line, you didn't get sent to your room. You got shamed publicly, because nobles didn't just raise children, they raised symbols. And a flawed symbol was a family embarrassment. Now you might be thinking, well, at least they had food, right? And beds. Sure, the meals were better, the walls less drafty, but that came at a cost. You ate under scrutiny. You dressed under supervision. You couldn't run barefoot in the grass or climb a tree without someone saying, "That's not proper." You couldn't cry too loudly, laugh too hard, or say what you really thought. You were never alone and yet often felt isolated. Because while peasant kids had freedom of movement, even if it came with hardship, noble kids had everything except freedom. You couldn't choose who you were. You were born into a role, and that role became your skin. Some rebelled, some withdrew, some became excellent actors. But most simply adapted, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. And as they grew older, the stakes grew higher. A noble boy who embarrassed his house could ruin a marriage alliance. A noble girl who spoke out of turn could cost her family a title. Everything came back to appearance, control, legacy. So yes, noble children had softer beds, but they also had sharp expectations. And while peasant kids were being broken by labor, noble kids were being shaped by pressure every day in every action, like clay forced into a mold carved centuries before they were born. No one asked what they wanted. No one cared if they were afraid. They were born to serve something bigger than themselves, a family name, a crest, a kingdom. So when you picture a little prince in velvet or a young lady dancing in the great hall, remember behind the manners, the lace and the smiles was a child trained to be perfect or perish trying. Because in the Middle Ages, even privilege came with a price. By today's standards, 12 is barely middle school. In the Middle Ages, it might be your wedding day. Because for medieval children, especially girls, marriage wasn't a milestone of love. It was a transaction, a duty, a timeline decided by adults who rarely asked what you thought. In noble families, marriage was less about romance and more about strategy. You didn't fall in love. You were positioned from as early as age 7. Children were betrothed. Not engaged like a modern couple posting on Instagram. No, legally promised, often to someone they'd never met, based entirely on land, power, doughy, or peace treaties. By 12, you could be married. By 14, expected to bear children. And no one paused to ask, are they ready? Because ready didn't matter. Biology and family benefit were the only prerequisites. If you were a noble daughter, your worth was measured in acres and alliances. Your beauty was described in ledgers, your doughy discussed in whispers behind tapestries. And once a match was made, that was it. You were packed, shipped, and paraded, usually to a stranger's castle to begin your new life as wife, mother, and silent ornament. No goodbye parties, no cake, just obligation. And if you were lucky, your husband was only twice your age. But it wasn't just the nobility. Among peasants, early marriage was also common for different reasons. You weren't sealing political alliances, but you were securing help. More hands on the farm, more bodies in the field, and children. The sooner you started, the sooner they could start working too. For poor families, a daughter was a liability until she was married. That meant one less mouth to feed and potentially a small doughy in return. So yes, if the blacksmith's son showed interest, parents moved fast. Marriage was business. Emotions were secondary, if considered at all. And what about the children themselves? Well, most didn't have much to say in the matter. Some had no idea they were even engaged until the ceremony preparations began. One day, you're helping your mother stir the soup. The next, she's braiding your hair and explaining how to address your new husband, who's 27, owns 2 goats, and doesn't smile much. You learn to adapt, or at least pretend to. And for boys, it was only marginally better. Young noble boys might be promised in marriage before they even knew what the word meant. And when the time came, they were expected to take on adult roles, household management, land oversight, military obligation long before their voices settled into adulthood. No one eased you into responsibility. You went from playing with a carved wooden horse to managing actual horses, staff, tenants, and in-laws. Marriage wasn't the end of childhood, it was the eraser of it. And while today's weddings are filled with emotion, celebration, and personal vows, medieval child marriages were often tense, quiet, and transactional. There were no long romantic walks, no slow dancing under candlelight, just negotiations, contracts, and the quiet pressure to not embarrass the family name. If love happened later, eventually it was a fortunate accident. Most couples were strangers at first, some remained that way, and the risk for girls was even greater. Young brides faced not only emotional strain, but physical danger. Their bodies weren't ready for childbirth, their minds weren't ready for motherhood, and yet no one waited. If you bled, you could breathe. And silence. Other times sent back to your family as a faulty match. It wasn't just early marriage, it was early commodification. Children turned into tools of diplomacy, labor, or legacy. And once the papers were signed, there was no going back. You belonged legally, socially, and emotionally to someone else. Some children found kindness in their spouses, others found cruelty, but all found one thing in common. No one asked what they wanted because in the medieval world, marriage wasn't about love. It was about lineage. It was about land. It was about control. And children, they were just the first pieces moved on the board. In the Middle Ages, parenting wasn't gentle. It wasn't patient, reflective, or supported by parenting books with pastel covers. It was loud, it was physical, and it came with a stick. Because back then, the phrase "spare the rod, spoil the child" wasn't a proverb. It was a policy. Children were not seen as fragile, emotional beings in need of guidance. They were viewed as wild, sinful, unruly, small adults with big faults that needed beating out of.